Hello, everyone. My name is Matteo Farinella, and I'm here today to talk about cartoon science or science comics, which is what I do, what I'm passionate about. I want to start very briefly with a bit of background about myself. I studied science, studied first biology, and then did a PhD in neuroscience. But I always had this passion for comics. I love to draw. I love to tell stories. And I always been reading comics and started over the years writing my own comics. However, these two things always kind of clashed in my head. I couldn't see a way to combine them just because I'd never seen it done before. Science was something that was presented to me as something very serious, very formal. Comics were almost like the stereotype of the kind of childish entertainment. So for many years, I kept these two things very separate. I was doing my science during the day, and I was saving my comics for my evenings and weekends. And the two things, again, they didn't mix at all. My comics were not about science. They were about my life, about fictional stories. This all changed when I started to talk to Hannah Ross, who was another scientist in my lab, but she also had a background in science communication. And she was the first one to suggest to me that it is precisely because of the comics format at this very informal, very approachable reputation, that it could be useful for us as scientists to reach beyond the walls of our institution and talk to non-scientists. So to make a long story short, we started writing this book, Neurocomic, which was kindly supported by the Wellcome Trust and was published in 2013 by Nobrow Press. And the book was fairly successful, definitely more than I ever hoped for. It was quickly translated in more than 10 languages, and people wrote us telling us how great it was, how it made this complex subject finally more engaging and more interesting to them. And it really kind of changed my career, because for the first time I realized this thing I was doing, comics, was not just a kind of useless hobby, pastime, but it could actually be useful in science communication. So that's what I started doing. I started working as a science illustrator, science communicator. I wrote more books about neuroscience, both for adults and for children. And I also started collaborating with other scientists from all kind of different fields, using comics to make their work a bit more engaging. But because I had this academic background, I couldn't stop wondering what even are science comics and what can they do for science? Is there one thing they can do, or like they're kind of combining different strategies? And thanks to a fellowship at the Center for Science and Society at Columbia University, I was very lucky. I got to spend 3 years researching this emerging field. And one of the first things I did was to collect as many examples as I could find of other people, other artists working in this format. And I put them all on this website, cartoonscience.org, mostly for myself, just to see other examples of this work, but also to give the field a bit more visibility. And today I want to give you a very quick, very brief overview of different types of science comics and what can they do for you. And the main distinction I started to notice right away is that there are expository comics and narrative comics. And I want to start with the expository one because they are, I think, by far the most common, partly because scientists are more comfortable writing in this format. So these are, as you would expect, kind of illustrated essays. You take a text, an explanation about something, of some scientific subject, and you add pictures to it, which, as we all know, it's in itself very useful, and I've done it myself many times. But what I find particularly interesting is when you start to play with the layout of comics. Specifically, there are scholars like Nick Souzanis who pointed out that comics have this dual nature. You can read each panel sequentially, very much like a text, like a page of a text. But when you put them all together, you can also create connections and interesting kind of consonances between different panels, and tell stories with the layout you cannot tell without any individual panel. Just to give you a concrete example of this is a comic by Souzanis himself, who also draws comics. It's a comic about climate change, and you can see how it starts as a very traditional diagram explaining greenhouse effect. But then what it does is through this diagonal here, it connects the very abstract data of global temperature trends with the very concrete effects of climate change we are starting to see in our life. And this is something very subtle, which I think you can spell it out with words, but it doesn't quite have the same effect that it does on this page. So if you push them in this direction, you can start to use comics almost as diagrams. And you can see here, this is a particularly experimental author, Chris Ware, who really borrows quite heavily from the language of scientific diagrams and scientific figures. But you can do all this in the service of a scientific story explanation. If you go in the other direction, you can see some narrative comics, so very narrative driven, and this is something that comics are very good at doing, I think, telling stories. And in fact, some of the earliest and most popular science comics I found were biographies of famous scientists. And this is something I also started to do recently as part of my job at Columbia University. We are telling these very brief 6-panel strips, which are origin stories of scientists working at the Institute. And we are trying to specifically focus not on the superstar Nobel Prize winners, but on early career scientists, PhD students, postdocs, even lab technicians, other staff members that work at the Institute, and just trying to just to show the diversity of stories, how people end up working into science and humanize science a little bit. We collected now more than 30 of these. You can find them online as The Science Life. And these are great, but they work, of course, if you have a main character who's willing to tell their story. It becomes very hard to do when you are trying to communicate at the two ends of the scale spectrum, so the very, very large or the very, very small. But I think this is where comics have another trick up their sleeve, because they can turn anything from a planet to a cell into a relatable character. And this may look like something, again, very childish, but some people like Scott McCloud argued that these simplified characters that are so popular in comics are popular precisely because they are more universal. So they allow a wider audience, regardless of background, to project themselves in the story and read about topics that they may not otherwise be interested in. And this is something, again, I do very often in my own comics, starting from Neurocomic, where we turned brain cells, neurons into characters. But I see in many other examples as well. People turn anything from insects to fishes into characters, into anthropomorphized characters. And this allows them to tell very complex science stories in, I think, a much more easy, more engaging format. So these are just two examples of things you can do with comics. Of course, it doesn't mean that you cannot combine both. In fact, I think some of the best comics kind of go back and forward between more narrative-driven sequences and more explanatory sequences. And if you want to see more example of this, again, I encourage you to explore cartoonscience.org. If you are an artist yourself, a comic artist working in science comics, please get in touch with me. I always want to hear more about other people's work. And thank you so much. I hope we can connect soon. Bye.